Sure. Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for joining us today for this Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission briefing on human rights in Saudi Arabia. In less than 2 weeks, on November 21 and 22, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will host world leaders for the annual G20 summit. The theme of this year's summit is realizing opportunities of the 21st century for all. In late October, in preparation for the G20, the Saudis hosted the W20 Women's Summit. Hosting events like these is part of Mohammed bin Salman's strategy to improve his country's international image and persuade the world that he is a reformer. That's the message we're getting from the Saudi government and its lobbyists since MBS was appointed Crown Prince in 2015. Yesterday, the Saudi embassy sent us a pamphlet that lists the, quote, human rights reforms decreed since last year. The list includes measures that all of us surely welcome, like the abolition of the death penalty for minors and the effective elimination of flogging as a criminal punishment. It also includes the decisions to permit women to drive and to travel abroad without male consent, and an easing of restrictions on public dress. Again, we can agree that these are good steps that likely improve women's lives. But these apparent reforms do not provide individual Saudi citizens, men or women, with any guarantees when it comes to the exercise of their human rights. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a religious monarchy that rules by decree. The royal family makes the laws and controls the institutions that enforce them. They are in control. All that really matters is what they will tolerate and how they decide to wield their discretion. That is why Raif Badawi's original sentence of 7 years and 600 lashes for blogging was increased to 10 years and 1,000 lashes after he dared to appeal. It's also why he has only been forced to endure 50 of those 1,000 lashes so far, a merciful reprieve that I hope with all my heart will continue. It is why the decision to permit women to drive went hand in hand with throwing the courageous women who advocated for that change in jail. Among them, Lujain Al-Hatul, whose sister is with us here today. It's why Jamal Khashoggi could be ordered killed in the government's own consulate. And it's why those who ordered his barbaric murder have escaped all accountability. Rule of law and human rights protections do not operate in Saudi Arabia, and those who advocate for them put themselves at risk. During the last 5 years, the same years that the Saudi government has been promulgating these reforms, it would like us all to focus on, the opportunities for expressing dissent within the kingdom have been progressively closed down. Since 2017, the Saudi government has intensified its pursuit at home and abroad of those who criticize its policies. Authorities have detained activists, clerics, Islamic figures, and journalists from across the political spectrum, not to mention the dozens of wealthy individuals who were rounded up and kept in the Ritz-Carlton for months as part of the supposed anti-corruption campaign. And as you will hear today, increasingly the government is pursuing its opponents outside its borders. So enough is enough. The Saudi human rights record has not improved. It has gotten worse. For me, Jamal's murder was the last straw that motivated me to introduce H.R. 643, which stops all U.S. arms sales and transfers to Saudi Arabia. By the end of this briefing, I believe that you'll understand why this bill is necessary. So I would also take this opportunity to call on the Saudi government to release all prisoners of conscience. Their jails are filled with people who have done nothing wrong other than to express dissent. Their human rights have been not only minimized, but have been violated in the most egregious ways. And I hope, as we look toward next year, that there will be a refocus in our own State Department here in the United States on human rights. It is something that's been lacking for the last 4 years. I've always felt that the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And that means even speaking up against human rights violations in countries where we supposedly have alliances. So I would expect and I hope that the next administration will be more forceful on this issue. So now let me turn to Maren Turner, the Executive Director of Freedom Now, who will moderate this briefing and introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses. And again, thank you all for being part of this. This is an important briefing.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Representative McGovern and Representative Smith and the Lantos Commission for organizing this event and for your dedication to sharing the truth about what is happening in Saudi Arabia. I'm Maren Turner. I'm the Director of Freedom Now, which is a U.S.-based organization that works to eliminate government repression. My organization has advocated for the release of political prisoners around the world and provides legal representation to Lujain Al-Hidari, whose sister is with us here today. I just want to echo some statements made by Representative McGovern. With Riyadh's hosting of the G20 less than 2 weeks away, this briefing will provide members of Congress, government officials, and the public with a better understanding of the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia and how the U.S. can pursue a more constructive engagement in the next administration. Saudi Arabia has earned considerable notoriety in recent years for its military campaign in Yemen, the shocking murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and the systematic repression of its citizens from whom it accepts no criticism of its authority and no deviation from its policy. Within the country, nearly every aspect of political and civil life is tightly controlled by authorities. Employing repressive laws and mass surveillance, the Saudi government has imprisoned thousands. Mohammed al-Qahtani, Raif Badawi, and Walid Abu al-Kahir are among those who symbolize imprisoned critics. Even members of the royal family have not been shielded, and Jamal Khashoggi is among many whose punishments for speaking out has been death. Dissent in Saudi Arabia is simply not permitted. The government spends considerable money and energy to hide its systematic human rights abuses by showcasing reform, a supposed change in mindset spearheaded by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But despite headline-grabbing announcements, the repression is still the norm. In the lead-up to the G20, Saudi Arabia convened groups to highlight issues related to the role of women and civil society, while at the same time, many women's activists are imprisoned and civil society space remains heavily restricted. The whitewashing campaign has not gone unchallenged. Human rights organizations and activists, international media, and foreign governments have raised the volume on their criticism of Saudi Arabia's hypocrisy. Policymakers in the U.S., the UK, and the European Union have called on their governments to downgrade participation in the summit, and some invitees for associated G20 events, like the mayors of New York and London, declined. In Washington, Representatives Jan Schakowsky and Ilhan Omar led more than 40 of their colleagues in a letter earlier this month calling on Secretary of State Pompeo to boycott the G20 this year. Today, we will hear from a panel of 5 distinguished experts on Saudi Arabia, all of whom have considerable knowledge about the country and its abuses, and some of whom have firsthand experience with the regime. I will introduce each speaker when it's their time to speak, and I ask the panelists to speak each for about 5 minutes so that we can have some time in the end for questions. I will now turn to Lina Al-Hidari to share the story of her sister Lujain and the suffering her family has been put through now for more than 2 years. Lina?
Thank you, Madam. Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and distinguished members of the Commission. On behalf of the Al-Hidari family, I'd like to thank you for organizing this briefing on human rights situation in Saudi Arabia and to allow me to talk about the detention of my sister, Lujain Al-Hidari. Lujain is a prominent Saudi activist and noted women's rights defender. In May 2018, Lujain was arrested alongside a dozen human rights activists and held for 10 months without legal charges. Now, Lujain is facing trial, but the worst could yet come. Lujain could be sentenced for her peaceful activism and for fighting for women's rights in Saudi Arabia. Before the recent changes in Saudi Arabia, women were not allowed to drive and were subject to a complete guardianship system under which a man controls nearly all aspects of a woman's life, from her birth to her death. This is the context in which Lujain began her campaign to reform Saudi Arabian society in 2013. Almost immediately, she was pressured by the government to end her activism. She was first arrested in December 2014 after she tried to drive from the United Arab Emirates to Saudi Arabia. Lujain was arrested at the Saudi border and released after more than 70 days in prison and placed under a travel ban for several months. In September 2017, the Saudi government announced that the ban on women driving was going to be removed the following June. Lujain received a call before the announcement from a Saudi official forbidding her from commenting or talking about the lift of the driving ban on social media, an order she had respected. Lujain moved to the UAE and enrolled into a master's degree in sociological research at Kafala University in Abu Dhabi. March 2018, Lujain was pulled over by security officers while driving, forcibly put on a plane, and transferred to a prison in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. She was released after a few days but banned from traveling outside the kingdom and warned not to use social media. On May 15, 2018, Lujain was arrested and removed from her home without any warning or explanation. We hope that Lujain would be released on June 24, the date that the Saudi kingdom removed the ban on women driving. That glorious day arrived, and we were delighted to see Saudi women behind the wheel, but her sister was not freed. In mid-August 2018, Lujain was transferred to Zahban prison in Jeddah, and our parents were allowed to visit her for the first time since her imprisonment. My parents saw that Lujain was shaking uncontrollably, unable to hold her grip, unable to walk or to sit normally. Our strong, resilient sister blamed it on the air conditioning and tried to assure our parents that she would be fine. After the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in October 2018, we read reports claiming that several people detained by the Saudi government at the Ritz-Carlton had been tortured. Our parents visited Lujain at the Zahban prison in December 2018. They asked her about the torture reports, and she collapsed in tears. She said she had been tortured between May and August 2018, when she was not allowed any visitors. She had been held in solitary confinement, beaten, waterboarded, given electric shocks, sexually harassed, and threatened with rape and murder. Our parents then saw that her thighs were blackened with bruises. In March 2019, Lujain was finally given her official charges. The charges center around her activism. They include participating in international conferences to talk about the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, being in contact with journalists, and applying for a job at the UN. In April 2019, the trial was postponed to February 2020, a period during which Lujain was held in solitary confinement. When the trial restarted in February, only 3 sessions took place, and there was no advancement in the trial. In March 2020, the last scheduled trial session was cancelled and postponed to an indefinite date. There has been no trial session since, or notification from the courts on the trial process. Family visits to Lujain were forbidden from March until the 31st of August 2020. The Saudi authorities, the state security, told our family it is due to the new organization to COVID, which could have been understandable, but calls were also cut during that period. On August 31st, our parents were allowed to visit Lujain after 4 months of no communication. During that visit, Lujain told our family that she had to go on a 6-day hunger strike for the prison authorities to allow her to see and hear our parents' voices. After this visit, our parents had another visit on September 9th, after which all contact was denied again until October 26th. During this visit, Lujain announced to our parents that she will go on a second hunger strike as the prison is mistreating her and denying her basic rights, mainly regular phone calls to her parents. We are deeply concerned that this hunger strike, now on its 3rd week, will have a devastating impact on Lujain's already fragile health. More than 2.5 years have passed since Lujain was arrested in May 2018, and our sister is still indefinitely detained. The trial keeps getting postponed, and she's on a hunger strike. Also, Saudi authorities refuse to engage with us. Since Lujain's initial arrest, we have tried every possible means to engage with the Saudi authorities directly. But we have only received the deafening sound of their silence. Therefore, we are seeking solidarity and help from the international community to help us save our sister, whose sole purported crime is being an activist and someone who has put her life in danger to defend Saudi women's rights. Not only has it been nearly 3 years that Lujain is living in an endless daily hell, but her imprisonment and Saudi Arabia's new silence policy has affected my whole family. In fact, upon Lujain's return to the Middle East, and after being put on a travel ban in Saudi Arabia, my whole family was also punished for Lujain's activism. They have been put under an illegal travel ban and remain under it till this day. When they question Saudi authorities about this ban, nobody can tell them where it comes from, and they even deny it at times. Travel bans are extremely worrying in Saudi Arabia, as we see that the same modus operandi that the state security has been applying. People are put on a travel ban, and later they get arrested. I have not seen my family in 3 years. I've graduated without having them by my side. My parents are deprived from being grandparents. And most importantly, we all live in constant fear of reprisals and of my family's arrest. State security broke into our house once. They brought people to convince my parents to deny the torture. They ignore us when we inquire about Lujain's health and condition, and we get daily threats on social media. But we won't remain silent. Silence is not the solution, and we are convinced that the only thing that could help Lujain is speaking up. Respected co-chairs, we, the family of Lujain al-Hadloul, are grateful for the Lantos Commission convening this briefing to increase attention to Lujain's case and all human rights abuses she has suffered. We need the U.S. Congress to stand in solidarity with Lujain, let her know she has not been forgotten, encourage accountability for unjust treatment, and advocate for her immediate and unconditional release. We were heartened by the letter led by Representatives Jan Chawotsky and Ilhan Omar and signed by 45 members of Congress that demand the U.S. withdraw from the G20 summit unless its Saudi hosts address systemic women and human rights abuses. This was a welcome development, but we hope that the U.S. Congress will take bigger, bolder steps to ensure Lujain and all victims of the Saudi regime will be reunited with their families soon. Thank you again for your support.
Thank you, Lena. I'll just add that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issued a decision early this year calling for the Saudi government to release Lujain and finding them in violation of international law. And I'm happy to say, as I'm sure all the panelists are aware and many of the participants, that not long later, Saudi Arabia lost its seat on the Human Rights Council. And I look forward to some discussion a little later this morning about how effective international advocacy can be to seek the release of Lujain and others in Saudi Arabia. I now want to turn to Bethany Al-Hidari. Bethany is the Executive Director of the Saudi American Justice Project. Thank you. Bethany?
Thank you. I want to thank you for organizing this important briefing, and thank you to everyone on the panel for your incredible work for justice in Saudi Arabia, and especially to my colleagues at Freedom Forward, the Freedom Initiative, and the Saudi American Justice Project for their incredible and tireless dedication to justice in Saudi Arabia. So many of our brave colleagues in Saudi have been wrongfully detained, harassed, tortured, silenced, and even murdered for trying to speak. And others on the ground put their lives at risk to speak the truth. So this platform to speak about what's happening is so important. Especially now more than ever, as the Saudi government has poured millions of dollars into propagating globally that it is a country in the process of creating meaningful reforms. This misinformation has fogged the reality on the ground in a dangerous way, which has literally cost people their lives. The repressive male guardianship system and the foreign sponsorship system, or Kafala system, in Saudi Arabia are entrapping women and children from all around the world and subjecting them to extreme violence, abuse, to human trafficking, and this includes U.S. citizen women and children. In 2019, the Saudi government announced cosmetic reforms to the male guardianship system, but this only applied to a privileged group of Saudi women and left the disadvantaged women exactly where they were prior. It was enough to be applauded around the world by individuals who didn't understand that women's rights defenders, such as Lujaina al-Hadlul and many others, were sitting in prison cells being tortured, that disobedience to a male guardian or husband is still punishable under Saudi law, and therefore even a woman who allegedly had the right to drive or travel would be in trouble with the law if her husband or male guardian did not give her permission to do so. There are several legal loopholes that exist today and uphold this patriarchal system. Similarly, last week, the Saudi government announced reforms to its discriminatory foreign sponsorship or Kafala system, where every foreign resident in Saudi Arabia is required to be under the sponsorship of employer or their spouse. In the same way, the reforms applied only to private sector employees who were largely Western, upper middle class, and unimpacted prior by issues of entrapment and abuse. The Saudi Ministry of Labor and Social Development specifically announced that these reforms would not apply to personal drivers, to domestic workers, to farmers, to shepherds, to security guards, nor would it apply to spouses of residents or Saudi citizens. Now, the application of this reform to a select minority of privileged workers in Saudi Arabia while maintaining a racist, classist, and sexist status quo for the most disadvantaged, abused, and vulnerable in society is unacceptable. And yet another demonstration that Saudi Arabia is making reforms not with human beings or human rights at the center, but instead with the intent of whitewashing human rights abuses and fooling the international community into investing into the nation. Stand before you today not only having personally witnessed unspeakable horrors on the ground in Saudi Arabia for nearly a decade while I was conducting my doctoral human rights research, but eventually as someone who was also entrapped for a time against my will in Saudi Arabia. I was wrongfully held in the country with my daughter, who is a dual U.S. and Saudi citizen, under these repressive kafala and male guardianship systems. They're merely a glance into the systemic and violent discrimination within the Saudi judiciary. In July of 2019, I was initially stripped of custody and course of my daughter for being too Western to parent. The Saudi judge wrote in the court record that my 4-year-old daughter needed to be protected from my American culture and traditions. Evidence of abuse was ignored, and in 2019, I faced several baseless arrest warrants. I was given a 10-year travel ban. I faced criminal charges for violating dress code, all without due process or chance to defend myself. The Saudi government failed to protect my child from abuse, neglect, and manipulation, and in collaboration with the Saudi Human Rights Commission, violated its own due process laws, derailed a rightfully filed appeal, and forced me to reconcile with my abuser, to degrade myself and my body and re-expose my child to a toxic and abusive environment. I had to beg the male guardian of my child to let us out, and my case is not unique, and it's not even as severe as several others. Now, last week's announced reforms to these systems would have translated into nothing for our case. My daughter and I made it back to my home state of Washington in December of 2019, where we had been granted temporary emergency jurisdiction, but we are still fighting the possibility of being forcibly returned to Saudi Arabia and Washington courts. In February of 2020, I founded the Saudi American Justice Project with another Saudi American mother who faced similar violations, and dozens of women from all around the world started reaching out to us who had been subject to rape, repeat abuse, the kidnapping of their children to Saudi, and male guardianship laws protected those Saudi fathers from kidnapping these children. 43 of the cases that I've worked with were with U.S. citizen mothers and children, and this is only a small glimpse into a problem that has spanned for generations that continues today. Today, as we speak, a constituent of Representative Bishop and Senator Romney, Caitlin, and her baby girl Aria, both U.S. citizens, were trafficked and held in Saudi Arabia by their father. Instead of being offered protection from this man who gave her stitches, put her in the hospital, subject her to marital rape, which is not a crime in Saudi Arabia, threatened her life on several occasions, instead of protecting her, they've been detained and are currently in a holding facility, refusing to be permitted to leave until her abuser, her husband, who's their guardian, gives them permission to exit. Caitlin and Aria and so many others have not been protected by these reforms. In 2018, I met a Filipino woman in her embassy in Riyadh. She came to Saudi Arabia as a domestic worker. She was repeatedly raped by her sponsor's 16-year-old son. When she went to the police to report it, they called her sponsor to pick her up, and she was beaten when she was returned home. When she became pregnant due to the rape, because of her faith, she declined to have an illegal abortion when her sponsor asked her to. They forced her and held her down while a coat hanger was shoved violently inside her body. When that failed to cause an abortion, the family decided to lock her up in the house until she gave birth, take the child, and have her deported. She doesn't know if her baby was killed, if it was taken and raised as someone else's. She would not be protected either by the reforms that were announced last week. These are only a few examples. The population that is suffering will continue to suffer, and the Saudi government has failed to protect both its own citizens as well as non-Saudi women, religious minorities, and children from extreme discrimination, violent abuse, and even murder. I'm grateful to everyone in Congress who's passed legislation and taken action for justice in Saudi Arabia. It's so important. However, I still face sometimes, even as constituents are literally being raped and trafficked to Saudi Arabia, the response when we're working on policy that Saudi is our friend and strategic ally in the war against Iran. Now, let me just reiterate that a friend does not kidnap our children. A friend does not violently abuse and rape our women. A friend does not spit in our face and say that we are unfit to parent, then turn around and beg us to place our military at risk to protect them. A friend does not make us complicit in war crimes in Yemen, which will now destabilize the entire region for years to come. And a friend does not ask a sitting president to save their ass from accountability for dismembering a human being and lawful resident of the United States in a diplomatic facility. The only solution here is an aggressive and just foreign policy, which places human rights at the forefront, not weapon sales, not business interests, but human beings. We must finally use the immense leverage that we do have as a global superpower to ensure that we are putting human rights at the forefront of the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany, for that extremely strong presentation. I'll note that the emotion in your voice demonstrates very well what you went through, and I think I can speak on behalf of the other panelists how sorry we are for what you went through. It's so commendable that you have now taken your experience and have created a campaign to highlight one of the most important issues in the country. So thank you so much for that. And now I want to turn to Safa Al-Ahmad. She's the acting director of a Saudi Arabian human rights organization called Alquist for Human Rights. Safa?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. On behalf of Alquist on human rights, I'd like to reiterate and wholeheartedly agree with everything Bethany and Dina have said. And it is actually quite horrifying where we are right now when it comes to what's happening in Saudi Arabia, and apologize if I repeat anything that anybody else has said. But again, just to contextualize this, Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, it's a theocracy, and it's a patriarchy. This trifecta gives the authorities limitless power over our daily lives. It may fluctuate from one king to the next, a degree of interference, but at its core, it has no internal checks or balances. The rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his ability to wipe out all competition, the other princes who were thought to be checks and balances, is living proof of how brutal the state can be to everyone, even those who we once thought were untouchable. Mohammed bin Salman is now the state personified. With him, everything is personal. Any criticism directed at him or at his projects or policies are dealt with swiftly. You can be disappeared, kidnapped, arrested, tortured, and in one horrifying case that we know of, killed and dismembered. But if you only follow Saudi-controlled media, you would think the kingdom has been ushered into a new era where women are emancipated, Islam is moderate, and everyone is free to pursue their best capitalist self. This is Saudi Arabia gaslighting at its finest. The reality is Saudi society has never been so scared of its ruler. Wave after wave of arrests and disappearances for perceived or imagined transgressions. Sham trials for not praying enough for the ruler, owning unsanctioned books, or obstructing the wheel of progress, whatever that means. We have unprecedented numbers of women and men fleeing the country seeking asylum. Reports of the government trying to track them down, hack them, and harass them via the same digital platforms that were our tiny window of freedom of expression. They even had the audacity to try to use Interpol to arrest some of these via red and amber alerts. The case of Saad al-Jabri, a former high-ranking intelligence officer close to then Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, is a perfect example of how the Saudi government is trying to use its global influence. They even sent a kill team to Canada to get al-Jabri only weeks after Jamal was killed. No lessons learned, no self-reflection, just impunity. But perhaps one of the scariest developments in the kingdom is what they are doing in the darkness, in secret prisons. Some in hotels, some in unidentified buildings, and some in palaces. Alquist has documented many of these cases. Today, I'm able to share with you details of one such case. Our sources took immense risks to tell us the fate of one of those disappeared since 2016. Sulaiman al-Dwesh, a man close to then Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, was kidnapped in broad daylight for the high crime of tweeting against Mohammed bin Salman, then Deputy Crown Prince. He was handcuffed, shackled, and flown to Riyadh in the dead of night to Mohammed bin Salman's palace. He was interrogated and beaten by a high-ranking Saudi official about his tweet. The beating was so violent and so severe, others had to intervene, fearing that he would die. He was covered in blood. The interrogator's white thobe turned red. For the safety of our sources, we are not able to reveal the name of this high-ranking official, but what we can reveal are details about this prison. It's in the basement of the palace, where there are makeshift wooden cells, temporary offices, a clinic where prisoners are sometimes able to identify each other and talk. It is dedicated to rival members of the royal family, high-ranking generals, and others. There's perhaps around 150 prisoners in that palace alone. Our sources tell us the prison is personally run by two individuals who are now infamous, Saud al-Qahtani and Maher al-Matrab. Al-Qahtani was then a close confidant and advisor to the Crown Prince. And yes, Maher al-Matrab is one of the 15-member team who murdered Jamal Khashoggi. They not only ran the prison, but they reportedly also participated directly in the torture. We are also told that Al-Qahtani joined interrogations remotely, just as was reported about Jamal. None of the Saudi authorities would admit to having al-Dwesh. They advised the family instead to go look for him in hospitals, mental health institutions, and morgues. The last any of our sources had seen him was late 2018, just before Jamal's murder. Sadly, al-Dwesh's case is not unique. Abdulrahman Sadhan was also kidnapped from the Red Crescent offices where he worked in Riyadh and disappeared on the 12th of March 2018. He was also placed in a secret prison and tortured. These secret prisons reportedly held both men and women, sometimes tortured in front of each other, sexually harassed, intimidated, and in one case, a woman was told that her children had died in a car accident to extract a confession in exchange for her to attend their funeral. She refused. She had to live with that nightmare for a month before they finally told her the truth that they were indeed alive. Abdurrahman's family did not hear his voice until nearly 2 years later. He was allowed 1 minute phone call to a member of his family. They have not heard from him since, and no official charges have been brought against him either. We are extremely worried about the safety and well-being of all the prisoners, but especially this year. Dr. Abdullah Al-Hamid, one of the most prominent political prisoners in Saudi Arabia, died in jail due to medical negligence this April. Journalist Salah Al-Shihi died of mysterious causes in July after being suddenly released from prison. Alquist has documented over 40 journalists, writers, and media workers currently in jail in Saudi Arabia. But we are well aware that these numbers and stories are just the tip of the iceberg. Saudi Arabia's hubris and impunity go well beyond its borders, and their accomplices and enablers are many. The Saudi authorities' disregard for human rights at home is reflected in how it conducts itself in the war in Yemen on a more horrific scale. And their partner in crime is another country that has an abysmal human rights record, the United Arab Emirates. Together, they have led a coalition into war on Yemen for over 6 years now, causing the country to become the worst man-made humanitarian disaster in the world, with no end in sight. The United States is directly implicated in this war, not only through selling arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also in its continuous war in the so-called war on terrorism that predates 9/11 in Yemen. It's time to fundamentally reevaluate this relationship. To bring stability to the region for us is to stop supporting our oppressors. Thank you.
Thank you, Safa. Yet again, you have painted a very grim picture inside the country in Saudi Arabia, but I appreciate as well going further and explaining the lengths to which the government will go outside of its own borders to attack any critics, dissidents, and anyone that they see as a threat. I will note as well, mention of the United States, something that we're well aware of here in Washington, D.C., is how much money the Saudi Arabia government spends on lobbyists here in Washington and elsewhere, I'm sure, as well. And some of the tactics I have seen them engage in, their lobbyists have been, when you compare them to other countries that also have their share of lobbyists in the country, I have been just aghast at some of the tactics that they have used here. So thank you for that. I just want to welcome, I see now Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee has joined us this morning. I just want to welcome her on behalf of the panel. It's nice to have you. And with that, I now want to turn to Sarah Lee Whitson. She is the Executive Director of DAWN, Democracy for Arab World Now. Sarah? You're still muted. We're still showing you as muted.
Okay. Got it. Just pulling up the thank you to the Lantos for organizing this critical and extremely timely briefing on Saudi Arabia's human rights record. My colleagues and friends today have spoken about Saudi Arabia's human rights record. I will refer to this record briefly before I turn to where America's own obligations lie. What I find notable about Saudi Arabia's human rights record is not its systematic thread repression of political and religions in the country.
Sorry, I just want to say your audio is going in and out a little bit. I don't know, maybe there's something disrupting.
I'm not sure what I can do.
Okay. Sorry, I just want to...
What do you recommend? Should I resume?
Yes, please resume.
Okay. As I was saying, what I find notable about Saudi Arabia's human rights record is not its systemic, widespread repression of political and religious freedoms in the country, enforced not only by the persecution described and the long prisons against those who speak out, but also executions, kidnappings, murder, or travel bans and hostage incidents that put it in the league of in the world. Greece is not alone in carrying out violation of national humanitarian law in war zone. In this case, it's war of choice in Yemen, whereas it instantly bombarded hospitals, schools, universities, factories, and homes and directed tens of millions of civilians to an air-sea land blockade that has caused suffering, starvation, and disease for 100,000 Yemenis. The Middle East region is rife with of governments that terrorize not only their citizens, but also people in countries. What is notable is the extent to which the United States has allowed it to become an accomplice in Saudi Arabia's crime, aiding and abetting the war in Yemen as a direct participant, for which the Trump and Obama administrations feared legal liability, authorizing unprecedented levels of military sales, $100 billion over the past 13 years, making Saudi Arabia this country's number one weapons clients in the world. We've done this with full knowledge of Saudi Arabia's relentless crimes and provided them to boot diplomatic cover at the United Nations, shield it from scrutiny and accountability. We've also provided Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government political cover for domestic human rights abuses, including the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. There may not be much the United States can do in Saudi Arabia's abuses. It is a sovereign country, albeit sadly ruled as an absolute monarchy with no voice for its own citizens. International organizations like the UN Human Rights Council and other legal and judicial efforts are the most appropriate mechanisms the United States should take when system reform of its rights. The law the United States can do and supporting and enabling this movement and to uphold its own responsibility not to commit or contribute to human rights abuses. The war in Yemen, U.S. military sales in support of Saudi Arabia did not start under the Trump administration. Some senior Obama administration officials have acknowledged their mistake in supporting Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen as a concession for the Iran deal that Saudi Arabia was forced to tolerate. The Obama administration attempted, however feebly, to curb some arms sales in the waning months of its term, faced with so many deliberate attacks on civilians in Yemen and growing public outrage. In defiance of the U.S. executive branch, the U.S. Congress refused to go along with U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. In rare moments of bipartisan consensus, U.S. Congress voted twice under Trump to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia and U.S. support for the Yemen war. Sadly, President Trump vetoed both efforts and stymied all efforts to curb arms sales. Instead, he doubled down on his support for the impulsive, reckless, and sadistic Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, boasting, and if you'll excuse my language, about saving his ass after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, refusing to sanction him, although the Trump administration did sanction low-level accomplices, and blocking the release of the Director of National Intelligence report on the Crown Prince's complicity in the murder. The heartening news is that President-elect Joe Biden has clearly and unequivocally promised to end U.S. military and diplomatic support for Saudi Arabia, as he has promised to reassess U.S. interests in the region and ensure they align with American values and international human rights. I want to read his words from a presidential debate last year because they are important, and we intend to hold him to this promise. Yes, President-elect Biden said, I will punish senior Saudi leaders. Khashoggi was murdered and dismembered, and I believe on the order of the Crown Prince, I would make it very clear, we are not going to sell more weapons to them. We are going to make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There is very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. I would end the subsidies that we have and the sales of material to the Saudis who are going in and murdering children in Yemen and murdering innocent people, and they should be held accountable. We hope that President-elect Biden recognizes that military sales are only one part of American support for Saudi Arabia. The Trump administration's stationing of thousands of troops there directly contributes to the survival of the monarchy. As President Trump bragged, they, the Saudi government, wouldn't last a week if we're not there, and they know it. a Biden administration should pull out of the business of propping up unelected governments, in this case, an unelectable, unaccountable monarchy in Saudi Arabia. Emboldened by unconditional U.S. backing, the Saudi regime has committed human rights abuses with impunity both abroad in Yemen and at home, including the ongoing detention of peaceful political activists such as Salman al-Audi and Walid Abu Khair, as well as senior royal princes who might criticize the crown prince, including former crown prince Mohammed bin Nayef, Prince Ahmed bin Abdulaziz, Prince Faisal bin Abdullah, and his brother Turki bin Abdullah. U.S. backing has also emboldened Saudi Arabia's destabilizing regional belligerence. This is all the more frightening in the face of existing Saudi efforts to develop nuclear weapons. Restoring a nuclear agreement with Iran and encouraging regional dialogue for peaceful conflict resolution with its neighbors, both of which Biden has promised to do, will not be aided by the continued presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. Holding Saudi Arabia, and specifically the Crown Prince, accountable for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is an important goal that Biden has promised. He can readily contribute to this with the stroke of a pen by ordering the public release of the DNI report. This will help the efforts of my own organization, DAWN, as well as Khashoggi's widow, Khadija Jengiz, to hold Crown Prince MBS and his henchmen accountable in a court of law for luring a U.S. resident journalist outside of the United States in order to murder him. President-elect Biden's stated goal of reassessing our relationship, not just with Saudi Arabia, but with other abusive governments in the region, including Egypt, to better align with our values and human rights commitments is encouraging. The U.S. is not responsible for fixing all that is wrong in Saudi Arabia or any other country in the world. Too much has gone catastrophically wrong with misguided, often false intervention in the Middle East in the name of human rights. A Biden administration can and should lead our government to exercise humility and restraint in its relationships around the world and rejoin the multilateral organizations on which our collective survival depends. This also means ending U.S. abuses, including support of abusive governments like Saudi Arabia, as an important measure of our humility, restraint, and respect for the peoples around the world that our policies impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for highlighting the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, how bipartisan it goes, and for your calls that we reassess that relationship. This is obviously the perfect time now that we will soon be embarking on a new administration. And also thank you for very concrete offerings of what the U.S. can do to change its course. And with that, I'm going to now turn it over to our last speaker, Seth Binder. He's the advocacy officer from Project on Middle East, POMED, as it's known here in Washington. And I believe that Seth, you'll build on Sarah's comments further, speaking about the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and what we can do going forward.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the Lantos Commission and my fellow panelists. I hopefully will build and expand I'm going to give some, truncated comments. I have my full comments will be posted on the website. But I want to build on what the others have already said and, highlight again that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has committed gross human rights abuses inside and outside the kingdom. His disregard for the rule of law and internationally recognized human rights and norms and his reckless decision-making have affected regional stability and the human rights of Saudis, Yemenis, Americans, and many others. Unfortunately, the current administration has maintained its full, unconditional support for this regime. Instead of pushing back, the Trump administration has emboldened the kingdom's human rights abuses, even ignoring U.S. law in its efforts to protect the Crown Prince. Congress, on the other hand, has continued to pressure the Saudi regime, repeatedly pressing the kingdom to address its human rights abuses. In addition to groundbreaking bipartisan bills that were blocked by presidential veto, Congress has passed legislation that required the president to release a report that identifies those responsible for the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. held critical hearings and briefings like this one, and continue to speak out in opposition to the detention of Saudi women's rights defenders and other human rights abuses. Congress has been limited in its effectiveness, though. Hindered by structural limitations and power, it has ceded to the executive branch, coupled with this administration's complete embrace of the Crown Prince. With the new administration taking office in January next year, however, both Congress and the Biden administration have an opportunity to realign and restructure the relationship to elevate human rights as a national security interest of the United States. Saudi Arabia remains an important country with its influence on oil markets, counterterrorism support, and other regional interests. But the new administration should not continue to ignore Saudi abuses at home and abroad that are driving regional instability, undermining U.S. interests, and infringing on the basic rights of Saudis. Continued U.S. support for the Crown Prince and his regime, in the absence of significant reforms and changes in behavior, not only risk providing the kingdom with the capabilities to take actions in opposition to U.S. interests and values, it gives tacit approval to the crimes of the Saudi regime. The new Biden administration should follow through on its campaign promise to end support for the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen, and should extend that promise to include the suspension of all U.S. arms transfers to the coalition. It should also take steps to secure accountability for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi by releasing the intelligence report the Trump administration classified, sanctioning any individuals in the report identified as responsible for the crime who are not already sanctioned, expelling a number of Saudi diplomats given their abuse of diplomatic facilities, and refusing to hold high-level meetings with Saudi officials. The administration should use the leverage gained by taking these steps to secure meaningful concessions from the Saudi government, including releasing and exonerating all human rights defenders, bloggers, journalists, and civil society activists, including the women's rights activists arrested in May 2018, abolishing the male guardianship and Kafala systems, adhering to the UN Convention Against Torture, ending the blockade of Qatar, halting the punishment and harassment of peaceful critics, and permitting freedom of expression within the political sphere, and ceasing all enforced repatriations, disappearances, arrests, and travel bans on individuals perceived as oppositional to the regime. Congress can help strengthen the U.S. position by following through on legislation it has introduced over the last few years. In particular, Congress should pass Representative Connolly's Protection of Saudi Dissidents Act, Representative Schiff's Jamal Khashoggi Press Freedom Accountability Act, Senator Murphy and Senator Young's resolution requesting information on Saudi Arabia's human rights practices in Yemen, and arms sales reform largely introduced as a result of Congress's inability, despite majorities in both chambers, to stop sales to Saudi Arabia. These include Senator Murray's Values in Arms Export Act, Senators Menendez, Leahy, and Kane's Safeguarding Human Rights in Arms Exports, Representative Omar's Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers, and Representative McGovern's bill that he mentioned earlier, as well as possibly revitalizing former Senator Biden's arm proposal that would require congressional authorization for arms sales rather than a veto-proof majority to prohibit a sale. Some argue that creating greater distance in the relationship with Saudi Arabia would result in instability within the kingdom and the wider region. This view, however, overlooks the destabilizing effects of the Crown Prince's authoritarian, one-man rule and reckless foreign policy. The new administration and Congress must impart some consequences for the kingdom's actions in order to right-size the relationship. By using its leverage and securing significant reforms, the United States can begin to take steps to return to a positive, mutually beneficial relationship with Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. I just want to note an article that has just come through while we've been discussing this morning apparently indicates that the Saudi ambassador to the UK has made remarks indicating that that there are conversations happening within the foreign ministry in Saudi Arabia with respect to possible prisoner releases. I think in particular, women's rights activists, which would include Lou Jane, has noted, in fact, that keeping them in prison any longer is just too political. I mean, this is sort of amusing to think about it in that way when apparently the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was not deemed to be too potentially problematic for Saudi Arabia's image. I just want to now open it up for questions. And so with this article as the context, I'd like to ask all of you, in particular, those of you who have very, very deep knowledge about what's going on in the country, and Lena in particular, you, as this might impact your family and might result in your sister's freedom. One, do you believe it? How common are these statements made by officials in Saudi Arabia? Obviously, on the one hand, we know that they have trotted out reform agenda and reform remarks, and what we've seen in the lead up to G20 has shown that the government has pulled out all the stops in terms of trying to say all the things that they think the public globally want to hear. How much do you think Saudi Arabia cares about his image? Is this just talking for image sake? How can they really, really care? How can they really be that concerned now with their image when all of the things that they have done in the last few years, well, going back many few years, but that have gotten a lot more attention internationally? Why now? And do you believe they might actually do it? And if so, what would be the motivation? Why make these releases now? So with that question, Lena, can I go to you first and ask for your response?
Yeah, thank you, Mala. So what's really interesting is that so the statement today by the Saudi ambassador to the UK, he's explicitly saying that Lou Jane's case has tarnished Saudi Arabia's, Lou Jane's and the other woman's case has tarnished Saudi Arabia's image, and for that, the Minister of Foreign Affairs is thinking about releasing them. So what we see is that, what does it imply? It implies that first, it's a political arrest, because he's saying, that the Minister of Foreign Affairs will take care of it, and not the judicial system in Saudi Arabia. Second, he's saying also that he wants to release them for the image and not for the human rights or, for respecting international conventions or anything. It's really about Saudi Arabia's image that he wants to release them. Third, it's about timing. What's really interesting to see is the timing now. So because of all the pressure that has been put on Saudi Arabia before the G20 and asking them to release the activists before the start of the summit, he had to go on media and to make this promise. But what we see is that, if it's a political decision, then it's not difficult for them to have it. They could just release them now, and not they don't need media for that. So I really think for us, at least with the people I have been talking with, including Safa, we really think that it's just a PR stunt before the G20, and they're trying to seize all the pressure regarding these activists, and that if they were really honest and wanted to release them, they could have, as it's a political case and it's nothing judicial, and because they have a leverage on the judicial Saudi system. So for me, it's only talk, and we won't believe anything until they effectively release them.
Can I add just to what Lena said? I think that it's really troubling that they're doing this for PR, and it's really, really important. People are listening to us right now to understand it as a PR stunt, because also, even like with the women that were previously temporarily released, like Aziza, they were released and her son was immediately arrested after. Realistically, what that means is that they're nearly under house arrest. They are under a travel ban. They cannot leave. Their family in Saudi Arabia cannot leave either. And so it is a way for the Saudis to get the pressure off of them leading up to the G20. So an article like that would be signaling to different government Western governments that, oh, look, we are trying to alleviate the situation, but that is really dangerous for anyone to buy into the propaganda. because this is how they get away with things consistently. Even with Jamal's murder and his court case, for example, to this day, they have not released the names of the people that they have issued those verdicts on. We technically do not know who these people are that are allegedly in prison. Right, and the reason before was that they needed an appeal. This never stopped them from naming Lujain and all the other women activists, putting them on front pages, branding them as traitors. So to me, this is the hypocrisy of the Saudi government and how, when it suits them, they know how to tarnish people's reputations and destroy their lives. But when it comes to people who actually committed a murder and dismembered someone in a count list, they are protected and unidentified. It is mind-boggling to me, and I would warn anybody who's listening to us right now that they should not take anything that they're promising at this moment seriously, unless there is fundamental changes inside Saudi Arabia. Because even if when they're released temporarily, that doesn't stop them from arresting them the next day. What stops them? There's nothing that's fundamentally changed in the structure of the Saudi judicial system to not stop them from arresting many other people afterwards. And this is what people need to be aware of. It's just a game for them. They just need to lessen the pressure on them leading up to the G20. After that, they don't care.
Thanks, Safa. We're now effectively at the end of the hour. I'm hoping that we can run over a little bit if everyone is still able to participate. In the hopes that we'll take some questions now. If all of you who are participating on your right side on the window, you can use your screen where it says Q&A and type in a question. Will come to me so I can field these questions to our speakers, to our panelists. In the meantime, I want to build on some of that and ask you all, we've spoken about just how much Saudi Arabia is doing to whitewash its image. That's a clear indication that they do care how they're talked about and how they're perceived internationally, while at the same time, obviously, they continue to do what they want, when they want, how they want. So those two, I would say, characterizations of the government are somewhat at odds. Seth and Sarah, you in particular spoke about what needs to change here in Washington, not just in Washington, but with Western governments. And you outlined some of the steps that need to be taken. I'm just curious if either one of you, and really I open this up to all the speakers, if Safa as well, if you have ideas to share about what do you think is most urgent among the panoply of options, not options, really the critical issues that need to be addressed, changes in course, as I said before. What do you think is most urgent, and what do you think the Saudi Arabian government most responds to in terms of what happened here or international advocacy? You know, for example, I cited the loss that Saudi Arabia had at the Human Rights Council. I can imagine that matters. How much it matters, I'm not sure. So with that, who wants to go first? You can just... Sarah, can I ask you?
Sure. I would say what's most urgent is for the United States to end its own abuses, its own contribution to harm. That has to come before intervening to try to have leverage and try to do good. First, the U.S. should stop doing bad. Stop harming the people of the region. Stop harming the people in Yemen by supporting the war in Yemen and by selling arms to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, given the devastating uses that they have made of their weaponry, not just in Yemen. Of course, the UAE's weapons in Libya and use of weapons in Libya has had terrible consequences. That has to be the number one priority. The United States has to clean its own hands. An immediate measure, an easy measure, can be releasing the Department of National Intelligence report on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Congress demanded release of this report. The Trump administration has defied Congress and refused to declassify it. There's a lawsuit against the government to compel release of this report. There is no reason a new President Biden should agree to keep that report confidential. We deserve to know, and the U.S. Congress has demanded that this report be made public.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I second what Sarah Leah was saying. I think, to just reiterate, this is something that a President-elect Biden could do day one in terms of releasing this report. It's classified. He could quickly unclassify it. And then, as Bruce Riedel and others have said about arms sales, not only future arms sales, but if the U.S. were to end transfers that are ongoing on a regular basis immediately, this is something that could lead to a grounding of Saudi jets going over Yemen in short order. Those two things are quick and easy things that a president-elect could do very quickly once he takes office.
Thank you. If anyone else wants to add anything to this discussion, please do. We do have a few questions that have come in, so I can turn to those questions. But before I do, I just want to give the other speakers an opportunity to respond generally to the discussion about what needs to change with particularly the Western governments towards Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, I would second Sarah and what she said, but I think it's really, really important that we realize the harm of the forever war that we've started since September 11 in the region, and specifically its impact on Yemen. So I think it's easy for Congress, when they are calling for the stopping the support of the Saudi coalition in Yemen, that it gives the impression that they're not directly complicit. So the number of civilians that have been killed under the Trump administration because of the drone strikes that were started in the Obama administration, but Trump had escalated. Those are direct things that can be changed fundamentally in the U.S. policy and understanding how to engage with the region. And there is no credibility in the U.S. For the U.S. in the region if they consistently see that happening. And so you can call on reform in the Saudi government or in the UAE, which is also equally complicit in Yemen, but it will hold no water in the region unless there is a fundamental shift, a paradigm shift in how the U.S. deals with the region. And that is one of the in my opinion, one of the most urgent things that need to happen. Saudi's relationship with the U.S. should not be unconditional. It should be very conditional. And this is one of the things that would signal seriousness and respect for human rights.
Thank you, Safa. A question has come in that I want to turn to you, Bethany, especially, but Lena also, and Safa, I'm sure you might also have some comments here. Someone has asked if some panelists can say more about the classist element of how the guardianship reforms are enforced. Are there specific examples of reforms that affluent women enjoy that less affluent women do not? I'm just trying to make sure I can see all of it. Is there a difference? This is an interesting element to this question as well, I would say. Is there a difference in the urban and rural treatment of women and how this gets enforced in terms of, like, in the cities, are you better off than you are if you're out in the countryside, or is it so total and complete, the system, that there is no difference? Bethany, can I first ask you to?
Sure. I would just say that so much of a woman's well-being in the country, whether they're a Saudi national or a foreign national, depends on the person that is responsible for them, and that is indefinite. So at the moment, male guardianship continues until death for Saudi nationals, and everybody in Saudi Arabia is under a Kafala system. So what that translates into is that unfortunately, within the legal system and the judiciary, we find that if your male guardian happens to be a nice person, then you might be lucky enough to exercise your rights. However, there are some loopholes whereas if you're disobedient to a male guardian, they have the right to put you in a holding facility or to file a case of disobedience against you, which puts you in a severely troublesome circumstance both ways. So, right, women can travel, Saudi nationals can travel. That was a reform that was made, but it's severely limited. If, for example, someone wanted to make the argument in court that their daughter or their wife was being disobedient by traveling, they could do so and stop their services. If somebody for example, comes and has a good employer or works for a larger company, they might have, an employer or sponsor or kafil who is allowing them to travel or allowing them to go out. But you can have some that will not give them days off, and some that, especially with domestic help, and this is people from developing nations that face much, much more difficult circumstances in Saudi. You can't leave the rights of human beings in the hands of luck, and the government has completely allowed that to happen by upholding these essentially modern forms of slavery, which allow significant exercise over the lives of women and children in Saudi Arabia. So it absolutely depends on the luck of the draw.
Yeah, I can give other concrete examples of what that means in Saudi. The class divide is an essential way, I would argue, how to understand the system in Saudi. And so the one of the massive reforms, or the alleged reforms for me at least, is that the lift on ban on women driving, right? This is where you can see clearly the difference in class and how that impacts the woman in Saudi Arabia. So if you are not in a city where there's a driving school, then you have to pay a horrendous amount of money just to go to one of these cities, be on a waiting list to be able to get to that driving school in the hopes that you will get that driver's license, right? Which translates to months. If the woman is able financially to pay that burden, to pay that cost, to find a male person or pay a taxi to get to that school, right? And so these are massive differences in the access even to the very few driving schools that exist in Saudi Arabia. And so in a way they've lifted the ban, but in reality the infrastructure itself was half-hearted in allowing these women to be able to have that access, right? If you're a woman of privilege, then you can travel to Spain or any other country and get a driver's license there and you're done, right? But if you're a poor person, and we've done some amazing surveys, and one of the things we asked is like, how has that impacted your life? It was like, hasn't impacted my life a lot, because technically I still need my family's support to be able to get that access, right? And so this to me is one of the problems of not following up on the alleged reforms that are happening in Saudi Arabia. Even simple things like lifting the ban on driving is not scrutinized enough, and there is no enough follow-up, especially from journalists, where there's a whole hoopla about, they lifted the ban, but where's the follow-up? The devil is in the details when it comes to everything Saudi Arabia does, when it comes to dismantling the patriarchy, right? They're not going to do that. They're going to try to have as many traps as possible to make it as difficult as possible for women to actually be emancipated. The other thing, which is also very disturbing to me, is this class difference, but also the privilege, for example, in introducing tourism, right? So tourism is a big thing now in Saudi Arabia, and the visa system is now changed, so then women can come and travel to Saudi. But look at the divide, right? What is acceptable? And this is the class divide of the difference between what are you allowed as a Saudi woman versus what are you allowed if you're a foreign woman, right? They put out an article a few months ago saying that if you're a single woman, you're allowed to stay with a man that you're not married to in the hotel. Of course, that does not apply to Saudi women. What you're allowed to wear as a foreign woman in Saudi Arabia does not apply to what you're allowed to wear as a Saudi woman, right? When it comes to concerts, they can allow you, but they can also arrest you for these things. We have this case of this woman that started dancing, but she was covered and she was arrested, right? And so it's so haphazard. And this poor woman probably didn't have the backing, wasn't from the right family, so she was arrested, and we don't know what happened to her. But others who are of privilege or foreign are encouraged to come, like these influencers who are asked to come and paid millions in some cases to come and showcase this amazing, modern, liberal Saudi Arabia. And so there's a schism. There are parallel lives of what it means to be a Saudi underprivileged woman and what it means to be a foreign woman in Saudi Arabia, right? And that is perfect PR. Again, going back into the PR of what the Saudi government wants to show to the West and the reality of how they are disrespecting their own women. I mean, we can talk about Sophia and the irony of giving a nationality to an AI and making her seem like, I think it's a message to Saudi women that you might as well be a robot, because you are going to get more rights as a robot and respect than if you are a national. And these things should not be ignored. These are quite symbolic of how the government sees its citizens.
Thank you, Safa. You mentioned a woman being arrested for dancing, which is reminiscent of another case I saw in Iran. And a question has just come in
There's so many similarities between Iran and Saudi. I mean, the theocracy is really I think they do more than disagree.
This is something I've noticed in the work that we've done. We've worked on Iranian cases and Saudi Arabian cases, and there's so much similarity there in terms of the way the governments are structured and the way that the human rights abuses. How would, and I open this up to all of you, how do you respond to the way that this is the question that came in, the perennial concern on the Hill, that this is a Saudi Arabia versus Iran, that the U.S. has, there's always this kind of, for lack of a better term, dumbing down of these conversations about foreign policy interests in the U.S. It's one or the other. You have to choose this country or the other country if the two countries are juxtaposed, adverse to one another in the region. And the conversation so often in Washington is that Iran is the real threat. And so if Iran is our enemy, then Saudi Arabia being also an enemy of Iran, then they are our friend. How do you respond to that, this characterization of it's got to be Iran or Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is not as bad as Iran, or doesn't pose the same threat to the United States, and so that then it becomes the focal point? Whoever wants to take this, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I would chime in by suggesting what President Obama very late in his term recognized and was promoting. What is in the interest of the United States, what is in the interest of Iranians, what is in the interest of Saudis and Emiratis and everyone in the region is peaceful coexistence and a balance of power. Saudi Arabia has brought interest in the region. Iran has brought interest in the region. There are many people around the world who've declared interest in the region, whether it's Russia or the United States or Turkey and so forth. They've got to have peaceful coexistence in the region. There is no reason to see Iran as a worse actor in the region than to see Saudi Arabia as an equally bad actor in the region, or the UAE for that matter, if you look particularly at its regional record. So this is not about a competition of who's worst. It should be about what is in the best interests for everyone, and that is regional peace and security. That is what the priority is. The worst thing the United States can do, which by the way it has been doing, is pump arms into the region to encourage division, to encourage hostility, to encourage this Axis coalition, which is perpetually threatening war against Iran, and to impose its own economic warfare against Iran. That is only going to inflame tensions, expand suffering, and again, make the United States complicit in gross abuses in the region.
Does anyone else want to add anything?
I would take the example again of Yemen and the impact of this alleged proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians there. And so the Houthis had a very limited relationship with the Iranians when we started the war, and I would argue that this war has pushed them closer and closer to the Iranians. For the Iranians, it's the cheapest war that they've been involved in. All they have to do is give the rhetoric and a few weapons. And it is really sad, but in Yemen, they say the Saudis and the Iranians are willing to fight to the last Yemeni. And so we must understand this rhetoric, and especially, I think, it started way before before Yemen, where this conversation about the sectarian divide, right? It's all about Shia and Sunni. And I think this is really, really harmful to the region, and it's not a healthy way to understand the power dynamics in the region. It is not a healthy way to do it, yet it is given an excuse to extremist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and AQAP in Yemen to use it as an excuse to get more people to fight for them in the name of religion. And so being cautious and stopping to use that rhetoric and buying into, at least within the Yemeni scenario, this paradigm as an excuse and accepting that the Saudis have to go to war because of Iran. I don't buy it. And now after all these years, this is where we are. And this is really quite frightening. I don't know where Yemen is going to be because of this. They've destroyed the fabric of society that used to be a lot more coexistent than they are today because of the sectarian language.
I was going to say we're now running out of time, so I think we do need to wrap up. I will just ask one final question, which is somewhat of an amalgamation of other questions that have been asked as well. As has been said now repeatedly, we're very close to the G20. Do any of you have do you have a final call towards the participants that are on this call, the people that are watching this, to officials in the U.S., to the UK, to other governments? What do you want? What do you have to say to them in advance of the G20? Whoever has a comment can chime in.
If I may, I think I would just say if they're going to participate, and I think there's legitimate, uproar over that participation, but if they're going to participate, they should follow in the lead of Joseph Stiglitz, and they should make sure they make a point to highlight everything that we've discussed today. The vast mass human rights abuses, et cetera. But I think that's a crucial act that needs to happen if they're going to participate. And just elevate the voices of those who are in prison and aren't able to speak.
Thanks, Seth. Lena, not to call you out, but can I give you the final word for this morning?
I would second Seth, and I would just add that in Saudi Arabia now, people cannot raise their voices for anyone. So the only way we can save prisoners, the only way they can be heard is outside of Saudi Arabia. The thing is that Saudi Arabia doesn't engage with its people anymore, so it cannot come from me because they don't even listen to me anymore. They just ignore us. So the only people who could be heard are their allies, and it's a duty now because being in contact with them, being in contact with UK officials, being in contact with the European diplomats is in the charges of these activists that are in prison. So being in contact with them, they're directly linked to these cases, and they cannot just turn a blind eye on these cases, and they have to ask for their release during this international conference. Otherwise, if Saudi Arabia, passes this event without releasing them and just being able to go through this difficult period, then they don't have any reason to do it afterwards. So it's the right moment to act now and to ask for the release of the JNS, all the Saudi activists that are in prison.
Thank you, Lena. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to all the panelists. You've spent your morning with us. I know it's been a very distracting week for some of us as well, particularly here in Washington, D.C. And I want to thank the Lantos Commission as well for continuing the conversation on Saudi Arabia. As I think we've all heard today, is extremely important that those of us that are aware of what's happening in the country are speaking out about it in as many different venues to as many different people in as many different ways as we can. And right now, as we're coming upon the G20, this is an extremely timely discussion. And I just want to thank you all for extremely substantive contributions, especially all of you had very extremely important information to share. And I can't imagine anybody coming away from this conversation with anything other than a genuine feeling about what the situation is there. So thank you. And with that, I think we'll call this hearing to an end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.